Hey, what's up, guys? Hey, wanted to make kind of a quick video here to talk about what I see as a big problem in advanced baseball statistics these days, and that is this idea that statistics should be proprietary and should belong to like a company somewhere, and we can never talk about how to calculate it and all that other stuff. I mean, I understand why. You're trying to make money. You want people to go buy your book or your series of books or subscribe to this or subscribe to that or whatever. You know, I get it. I understand it. And I don't think that people necessarily should be prohibited from doing this. But we have run into problems in the past. I've talked with you a couple of times now, and we're going to talk a little bit more about our field and some of the problems with our field that are really hard to figure out and really hard to reconcile because we just don't know. We don't know how it's calculated. And that's a big problem, right? It's hard for us to talk about statistics and to get everybody on the same plane when, you know, nobody will tell us how it's calculated, and instead we have to rely on these really vague descriptions that were published on websites like 20 years ago. And I'm not even exaggerating. That is what it's like. And so as a result, I have a different viewpoint of this. I think that if we're talking about statistics, we want to have a stat that everybody should use instead of being like WAR and having it with all of these kind of hidden machinations and have like weird stuff going on in the stat, stuff that maybe some people object to. I think we should be much more transparent about this, and we should show each other exactly what it is we're doing. And if you disagree with something, maybe you can modify the statistic for something that you like. And so I know I talked yesterday about this domination index. I'm going to show you a little bit more about this here. This is the so this is the blog, the Baseball Replay Journal. And this is a post that I made way back in April 1st. And here I explain the concept behind the so-called SD scores. SD score is a name that I really don't like. I like domination index better, and because what you're really measuring here is not SD, it's not just standard deviations. What you're looking at is how dominant a team was compared to the other teams in the same league in the same year. Now, when we talk about how to calculate this, instead of keeping it hidden or saying go buy their book, I went into their book and showed you how they did it. And then we can take a look here and see how to set it up for ourselves in Excel. Right, just as it says here, I use standard deviation P. Hopefully, I've done that in my spreadsheet. If I haven't, let me know and I'll change it. I use standard deviation P, and the reason why I use this is because we're looking at a population. So when we're looking here in this example, the 1927 American League, we're not looking at a sample of the runs scored in 1927. We are looking at the population. If you use standard deviation alone, it will act as if you're using a sample and not the population. Now, you could argue that using standard deviation alone is the right way to do it, and yes, there will be a mathematical difference. If you disagree with me, you're more than welcome to do this yourself with your own formula, or to, if you want to support the channel, you can buy a subscription here on the Substack site, and you can download this, and you can just change standard deviation P in the formula to standard deviation and see what it does, right? You can do this automatically. That's a little bit better than Baseball Reference, isn't it? Because you can actually change it. You don't have to sit down and let it be the same thing the whole time, right? We're interested in doing this because we want to see what happens if we mess around a little bit, say with the 27 Yankees, and make some other different thing happen. And then I show here as well how to calculate domination, the domination index for runs scored. Now, I will note that I have changed this a little bit in my calculation on the spreadsheet, because we're not talking about just a single team or a single league. We're talking about every single season for a certain league. And so as a result, we've had to do a couple of different things to allow us to calculate the average separately and the standard deviation also separately. Part of the reason for this is because I've been trying to avoid using an excessive amount of arrays in the formulation, because that really slows things down. I tried to use a bunch of arrays once, and it made it so that it was unusable. So we're trying to make this as usable as possible, but also hopefully make it so that you and I can go in and we can change little things around and see what happens if I push this button and what happens if I push that button. There's going to be a lot more of this around, especially on the blog. Now, there are problems with the domination index. There are also problems with the Dynasties book, like where it looks at great teams over a 5-year time span. I don't think so, because things change a lot in 5 years. Biggest problem with the domination index, though, as I've looked at it, is that a single outlier game can have a major impact on you. For example, as I wrote in this blog article, if you look at the 2001 Mariners, who famously were up 14-2 against Cleveland going into the it was the 7th inning, right? And then completely collapsed and lost the game 15-14. If you were to take that game away and look at the Mariners, assuming that that never happened and that they were still as that super powerful, suddenly they become a much more dominant looking team than they were in real life. Their domination index goes from 3.47 up to this 3.60956, right? And so they start jumping places in the list of greatest teams of all time. You can compare that to, say, the 1939 Yankees, who won a game. I just picked one at random, 17-5 against the Indians. If you instead pretend that the Indians did in 2000 or 1939 the same thing they did in 2001 and somehow came up with 13 runs, then guess what happens? Then the Yankees go from their all-time dominant total of 3.51 down to 3.44 for the domination index. That's one of the things you kind of have to keep in mind with this. Now, why am I talking about all this stuff? Who cares about it, right? This is just some, stat that somebody came up with 20-something years ago that I'm trying to resurrect and talk with you about. Well, the reason why we care about this stat is because we can do stuff with this stat. We can look close at this. We can have an idea of what it is that makes a team better than another team. What makes certain teams really stand out as being very, very good, much better than their competition, and what aspects of team play is it that makes teams look not so good. Maybe similar to what people say about WAR, maybe this statistic's not really intended to say, okay, well, this team's in first place, that one's in second place, because if the number's close, the number's close, right? There are little mathematical things that could be causing it to go wrong. Maybe we should be adjusting for park factors or not. I don't know. I would argue that when you combine the domination index runs scored and runs allowed together, you don't need to readjust for park factors because you're pitching in the same park that you're hitting in as a home team, right? Whereas when we look at this in terms of WAR and we're trying to separate everything out into different stovepipes and stuff, it becomes a lot more challenging. It becomes a lot more complicated. So that's sort of the way that I feel about this. Honestly, I like this statistic a lot, but what I really like about doing this is the fact that we can grab it and we can play with it, we can do different stuff with it. And the other thing I like about it is that when it comes to runs allowed, we're not separating pitching from fielding, which is what I think we should not be doing. I think that we should look at that simply as run prevention, as defense together, right? It's hard for me to say, oh, the 27 Yankees were great at not allowing runs to score because they had great pitching. Some of that might be due to great pitching. Some of that might be due to great fielding. I think, honestly, it's probably a combination of the two. And the more I learn about pitching and how it actually works in baseball, the more I realize that pitching and fielding are one and the same. And that all of these arguments you've seen over the last couple decades about how they're different is a bunch of junk. It's a bunch of junk from people who never play the game, and that I can assure you of. So that's sort of my opinion on this whole thing. You can play around with it a lot again if you want to become a paying subscriber of the blog. If you don't, and if you still want to play around with it, you can go on, grab the formula, and start messing around with it a little bit. It's really easy to set up. It's not that hard to figure out. Conceptually, it's not that hard to understand either. I think this is a lot easier to understand than some of the other problems. And I like it a lot because you can play with it, right? That's what it's going to be like here on this channel from now on. Right? If we're going to talk about anything that's statistic on the channel, on the blog, or anything like that, I want to set it up so that you can go play with it and you can make things happen, and we can go see, well, what happens if this changes and what happens if that changes, right? That's the big problem that I have with a lot of WAR. I can't play with it. I can't say, well, what if something else happened to Dante Bichette in 1999, right? What if we were wrong about this thing? What impact would that have? Well, we can't say because it's not open source. It's completely closed source, and we have to, as somebody said once on Reddit, just trust the geeks and trust what they say. I say that instead of having everything be proprietary and closed source, we need to embrace open source thinking and open source action as a society. And especially we need to think about this way when we think about our sports, because it's a lot more fun and it makes us be able to have conversations with each other instead of just yelling at each other and calling each other idiots and all this other stuff I see on Twitter and all the other waste places in our society. So there you have it. There's my little editorial for you, and hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you again with more tomorrow. Bye-bye.